everyone. This is Falcon Napier. Welcome to the Circle of Brilliance. And today we're going to continue our discussion on neurotransmitters and how neurotransmitters impact tension management. Now, on previous calls, we've pretty much talked about adrenaline, noradrenaline. We've talked a bit about dopamine. We've started to touch upon a couple of the others, but we haven't really focused on them to answer the big question. And so to kind of bring everybody up to speed, let's take a look at a change grid and let's kind of review what we've learned about the three neurotransmitters we've really focused on the most right now. And again, the question is, in the event that someone was experiencing an increased release of whatever these neurotransmitters may be, what would happen to their placement and movement along the change grid? So the first one that we talked about was epinephrine or adrenaline. This triggers the fight or flight response. The little paragraph at the bottom says that this is produced or released in stressful or exciting situations. It increases heart rate and blood flow, leading to a physical boost and heightened awareness. And so we said, well, what's really going on as far as our external environment, perhaps even part of our internal processing, in order for this to be triggered? And what we decided was that there is a direct relationship between the perceived level of challenge we associate with whatever we're encountering and the release of that adrenaline or that epinephrine. And so when we're up here in a high stressful situation where we could have that fight or flight response triggered, we would expect that there would be epinephrine or noradrenaline, or rather epinephrine or adrenaline being released. I don't know so much if that's going to be happening at 8, 9, and 10 on the challenge scale, but up there 11 and certainly 12 we're going to experience that. We also said that even though we may be up in stress because we don't view ourselves as having enough ability to meet that challenge, which would actually even aggravate that feeling of being in threat more. We might also experience it if we are very far out grid. So out grid again would probably be more about excitement rather than threat, but nevertheless, that high level of perceived challenge is what's triggering it. Now, what's the difference between out grid and up grid? In the up grid danger zone, we view our ability as being very, very low to non-existent. And in the outgrid area, the outgrid danger zone, we would view our ability as being extremely high. In fact, willing to tackle whatever that beast happens to be. So the difference, it would be a feeling of readiness to deal with whatever the issue happens to be, but nevertheless, that issue would be triggering high levels or very high levels of perceived challenge. Would you guys like to add anything to that, anyone?
Yeah, I will add to that I think, this is Brian, the norepinephrine is probably more of the outgrid than upgrid. And I would
Okay.
say that because remember, we talked about how they have similar structures, but their functionality is different just based on where, based on the receptors that they're connected to. Because norepinephrine is always released in the system, whereas epinephrine requires stress, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So that's why I say that it probably, for outgrid wise, it's probably more of the noradrenaline, and upgrid would be more of the adrenaline itself.
Okay, and just then to bring everyone into speed, noradrenaline is a concentration neurotransmitter. It affects attention and responding actions in the brain. It's involved in the fight or flight response, and it has some physiological impacts on blood vessel, blood flow, etc. Other comments, though, about where we would find epinephrine or adrenaline on the change grid? Thoughts about that? Don't be shy. Okay, so I still wonder, I'll give you guys a scenario and you tell me if you think there would still be some adrenaline going on. Let's put yourself at coordinates 12, 12, where you are facing a challenge of the highest order, but you genuinely believe you possess the ability to meet that challenge head on. And so this might be one of those superhuman, superhero sorts of situations. But in that moment, would you think that individual at a certain level is still feeling that while they may be able to meet that challenge is in exact proportion to their ability to meet it, which means they have just as strong of a chance of failing as they do of succeeding. So might we find some true adrenaline release there as well, and that's what's prompting them to pull out the sword and slay the dragon, or whatever the situation may be. Thoughts about that, or is that would you say no? That's just noradrenaline?
No, I would say that's definitely adrenaline, because remember, you're talking about the adrenal response, and so it's biologically designed to get you to move.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
The functionality of that movement is what's different, because remember, I said no neurotransmitter acts as a single actor. They always
Yes.
have support hosts in terms of receptors, and that's what makes the difference. So in other words, there are receptors in both the presynaptic connection and the postsynaptic connection, and if they don't match, they don't match.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So that's what makes a difference in how these neurotransmitters function. It
Right.
also makes a difference in terms of where they're secreted from.
And then let's add to that that one of the things we know for certain as we apply these principles of tension management is we believe everything is situation specific. So
Right.
whatever that context is can very much dictate what your bowl of neurotransmitter soup is going to contain. So for example, one of the most common examples we give of people being this far outgrid, what does that outgrid experience look or feel like, is an Olympic athlete. An Olympic athlete who is good enough at whatever their event is to believe they've got a strong shot of standing on that medals platform at the end of the competition. Now, they would most definitely view that they have a very high level of ability. They've worked very hard to get where they are. They know they're an Olympic athlete, a medal caliber athlete, but they do not begin to underestimate the challenge that the other worthy competitors represent. Now, they may not feel like any real physical threat. So fight or flight certainly isn't being triggered. If anything, what's being triggered is for their absolute personal best to be put on display, to be put to the test, and to hopefully be the one who prevails. So as I've just described the Olympic athlete, does that sound different to you than the person who is the knight in shining armor slaying the dragon? Yeah. So Ellen, Diane, Brian, you've all unmuted. Any thoughts about that? The difference between the Olympic athlete and the conquering hero?
I would say they're the same.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, it sounds similar to me.
Okay, and so, all right, so again, I think that what I just wanted to be able to say is that can we establish that there is a relationship between the perceived level of challenge and the release of adrenaline?
Absolutely.
Okay, yeah, and so, but we know that that has to be at a pretty high level. Now, when we look at noradrenaline, we're not looking at these life or death, fight or flight kinds of situations, but I still think the noradrenaline, now, Brian, you said there's always a certain level of it present, but
Yeah.
perhaps it becomes more pronounced as the level of challenge hits 6, 7, 8, 9. So a heightened level of challenge is definitely going to get my attention. So you've also said that that also might be present outgrid. So is there a connection between perceived level of challenge and the presence or the release of noradrenaline?
Yes, because remember, what it's going to do is primarily responsible for the sympathetic nervous system. And so, in other words, when you have this increased challenge, the heart rate, your blood flow, all those things start to escalate and elevate rather. And it's a natural process. These are connected to autonomous nervous system. So these things happen automatically without your prodding. And again, it's just designed to get you to move. So in other words, the interior is responding to your perception of the exterior.
Jane, you've unmuted. Anything you want to throw in?
Well, I was just wondering if, as you get upgrid from the way that I understand it, you can, way upgrid in the danger zone, that you become less focused sometimes and more really, afraid, and okay, I'll try this, and that didn't work for 2 minutes, so I'm going to try the next thing. And so I'm just wondering if you'd have more of the epinephrine would be the driver as opposed to norepinephrine focus, and the moves that you want to use in that area to bring you down grid are moves that help you focus. So, okay, let's break this down into small steps. What are we going to do? Step 1, step 2,
That's
and
right.
that would help to rebalance those, deep breathing, those kinds of things that would help to rebalance that ratio.
Absolutely. Well, you're absolutely right, because one of the things we've always said, hallmark of being that far up in stress, is that stress is characterized by reactive decision making. So jumping from one thing to another that seems like it can help you. There's not a whole lot of logical thought process going on. And that stress, and specifically that up in the danger zone, is characterized by lots of activity, but activity and productivity are dramatically different things. And so it's a lot of energy being expended, but it may be just being expended for no real reason. And that's that. So does that sound more characteristic of an adrenaline rush response or a noradrenaline rush response?
T, if I could add another dimension, which is the
Please.
cognitive piece. I hear somebody say something about breathing. Breathing is very nice, and we should certainly remember to do that at all times. But what I encourage my clients to do is change what they're thinking, change the perception of the task, and that will lower the noradrenaline. So, for example, you as a speaker may be aware that the most common anxiety in the US population before COVID was public speaking. And actually, there are some interesting questionnaires that people are more afraid of speaking in public than they are of dying. I just thought that was interesting. So you and I speak in public all the time and see it as a challenge. The thought that I have in my head is very different than the thought that the average person has in their head. Specifically, the average person thinks, oh my God, I'm going to say something wrong. They're going to see I'm stupid. This is going to be embarrassing. I've never had that thought. I walk in and think, I have something really interesting that you are going to enjoy. I'm giving you a gift. That's why my noradrenaline is down within normal limits. It is not up. When I'm speaking, I do not have an accelerated heart rate. When Olympic champions function, they do not have an accelerated heart rate. I've dealt with criminals who literally break into houses and commit crimes. And when I say, what were you thinking? They were thinking that this is a piece of cake. I say, didn't you have a rapid heart rate? And this one guy looked at me and said, Diane, I said, if I broke into a house, oh my God, I'd be sweating profusely. I'd be choking. My heart rate, I'd be having a heart attack. My hands would be so wet, I couldn't do anything. I'd have to pee. And he said, Diane, if I thought that way, I couldn't be in this profession. So what I'm adding to this wonderful elaborate scheme and circle of brilliance is what you think has a major impact on the level of adrenaline, noradrenaline, and dopamine. What do you think about what I'm saying?
Yeah,
and I'm glad you've brought that up, because one of the things that I want to talk about at a certain point is it possible, just by changing your thought process, that you can learn how to better control whatever's going on with your neurotransmitters? I mean, some of them are probably going to be triggered just because of external things that are happening, but can we learn? Because you've just described downgrid maneuvers. Downgrid maneuvers means normalize, simplify, restore resources, and add resources. When the thief says to you, Diane, this may be unusual for you, but it's normal for those of us in our profession. So that brings you downgrid, normalize, and simplify. And he goes, we just don't break in and then figure out what we're going to do. We have a plan, and
Exactly.
we put a lot of energy. So they keep themselves further downgrid. So at least out of the adrenaline rush, maybe there's still a certain level of adrenaline because they have to pay attention. They may be old hat at it, but there's always variables that could come into play, be that a dog or be that an alarm or whatever the case may be. So I think there's still enough noradrenaline going around for there to be attention being paid to what's going on, but they are not in any debilitated level of whatever these neurotransmitters may be. And it may be because they're doing their own downgrid maneuvers. They, even as they are driving to whatever the crime is going to be, are they going through this process of reviewing what they're going to be doing, how they're going to do it, I have to believe that sloppy criminals get caught.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
True, yeah.
So,
Yeah.
T, I'd love to give you an example from last week. I'm new to this group, and last week was my first time, and I really didn't know what to expect. Linda invited me to come listen to you do this, and so there we are. And what I found was the interaction with Brian explaining the technical, chemical, medical piece, and me adding some of the psychological, behavioral piece. It was very enjoyable. And afterwards, there were several people who texted me, and Brian and I had the conversation later in the evening that we both felt was very enjoyable. At the end, I'm ready to go to bed, and I'm thinking about my day, and I'm thinking, gee, that was really a lot of fun. It was unexpected. I'm normally a happy person. I love my work, but gee, this was extra fun. And then I put it together that the experience and the chemistry work together with the thought.
Mm-hmm.
When you take on a task, I know Brian said that when he asked his colleagues about explaining this in behavioral terms, they said, quote, good luck with that. When you take on a task that's a little bit beyond your comfort zone and you master it, the feeling of glowing, the feeling of happy, the feeling of success is exactly that dopamine combined with adrenaline, noradrenaline in the wonderful, exquisite balance formula where we felt unusually good by tackling a task that was just beyond our comfort zone, and we were successful. If it's okay with you, can I use your wife as an example?
Please do. Linda's on the call. Go
and
ahead.
Of course, I never asked Linda if I could do this, so you could always mute me if you don't like it. So I know Linda for something like 20, 30 years. I know her as an expert realtor. I know her as a master gardener. I know her as a support for her husband. I know her as a good friend. When she moved out to Arizona, she suddenly had a new task of finding like-minded people to be friends. Wow. And so as part of that, she joined the League of Women Voters. Okay, and she and I are talking back and forth, okay, at least you'll meet nice people who are interesting. Well, somehow she got put on a medical panel to check out the different types of medical insurance and this Medicare for all. And she was out of her league. In the 20 years that I know her, I never even heard her mention medical insurance. And suddenly she was tasked with reading articles that were initially out of her realm. And as she grasped more and more of it, she began to enjoy it to the point where I flew out when she gave a talk. I never knew her to give a talk. You're the one that always presents. She's always the wind beneath the wings. And she was just glowing. So my point is, some of us were thinking about, I could hear the questions, what can we do to increase noradrenaline or increase dopamine? Is there a pill or a medicine or a exercise or a food? If I drink kelp smoothies, will I have more of this? No. If you change what you think, the control is between your ears. And if you see something as a challenge that's just beyond your comfort zone and visualize how great you're going to feel when it's done, that is, there you go, my favorite out-grid maneuver. I don't want to do this task, whatever it is, but boy, am I going to be proud. Am I going to feel good when it's done? And I will enhance my skills. So I watched Linda do it. She lived it. And this is what we did last week. Is what I'm saying making sense to you?
Absolutely.
Well, and
Absolutely.
especially me, Diane, because I'd already unmuted before you started to tell the story. It's actually been 40 years.
Okay.
I met Diane on the very first time I gave my very first talk at a women's group. And I was so scared. I was talking about the change grid. I knew I'd done a horrible job, and Diane came up afterward and said, that was one of the most interesting things I've ever heard. And we became friends for life.
Exactly.
And then Diane's story picks up. 40 years later, I'm tasked with making a talk in front of 100 people at a university just north of us, put on by the League of Women Voters, who invited the public. And Diane was the wind beneath my wings that day. And we, even though every single piece of technology went wrong, I had to do the program without my PowerPoint notes. They just showed the picture and I had to talk. The ladies, after 20 minutes of trying, the lady running it said, just, you got to go on. Here you go. And let's welcome. And I said, okay.
Yeah, I see. And
Anyway,
everybody on the call are professional speakers. We can all relate to what Linda had
Right.
to deal with.
So I just wanted to say, my point was going to be, I felt so good after that talk, no matter how scared I was in the beginning, because I did know what I had to say. All I had to do was get going, and then I could say it.
I think for me, what I get from what Diane and Linda and Jane are talking about, that's tension management in action. Because remember, the nervous system primary responsibility is about this interoception. So in other words, these internal states, right? So the sensation itself is non-negotiable, right? So the fear, the doubt, the worry, those things are non-negotiable. You're to utilize that, and that's where attention management comes in. So when you get down to like what Diane was explaining, perception, the feelings, the thoughts, and the behaviors, those are spontaneous. They can be very deliberate, and then that helps you to optimize whatever it is you're feeling. Think about the pilot who landed on the Hudson. Those guys, they go and they practice crashing. But in a real situation, they get the same sensation of fear. And I have a friend who's a pilot, and he says they have these protocols, and he had to do an emergency landing in Nicaragua. And they go down, they went through step A, it didn't work. Step B, I think he said he got down to F before he was able to land safely. Now he had the same jolt of fear that one would expect in that situation. But he can optimize that situation. He can optimize that sensation by his training and going into like, what can I do? What do I have at my disposal? So that sense of control. So he can maximize an output.
And
Exactly. And if I could say that the same thing works from the bottom of your grid. If you have high ability and the perceived challenge is incredibly low, so the most boring thing I can think of is going to the supermarket. At least that was pre-COVID. Now it's more of a challenge. And I didn't like it. It was a giant waste of time. I felt that the system was working against me. It was stupid. And why should I have to spend my time in the supermarket? The thought that I created for myself is, number one, if I can buy everything that I need within 15 minutes, my groceries are free. And if I can do it within 12 minutes, I win free groceries for life. I mean, I would just make something up to make it more of a challenge. Or my favorite is if I can add everything up as I throw it in the cart and come within $2 of the final price, my groceries are free. Now, I'm making this up and I'm zipping through the boring task of groceries and I'm laughing and enjoying it. Get to the end and I tell the cashier it's going to be $67, and what do you know, it's $68.50, and I laugh. And she looks at me, now they know, oh, so you were adding it up in your head. Yes, and I did it in 12 minutes. So my point is that you can use your brain to get up from the bottom or to get down from the top. The sense that I had from last week was people were wondering what medication or food or exercise or breathing. You can eat all the kelp you want. I'm in favor of exercise. But if you want to control these neurotransmitters that are sympathetic nervous system, parasympathetic nervous system, you do it with your thinking. What do you think, Brian?
Absolutely.
Yeah, in fact, let me chime in two things just to bring this to the principles we are all need to be reminded of. And then, Joseph, you've got your hand up, so you're welcome to chime in just a second. When Diane was talking about going out there and finding a challenge, taking a little bit of a chance that is greater than your perceived ability. I'm putting it in our terms, obviously, but that's one of the outgrid maneuvers. So increase the risk that you are taking in your life. Step into more of a leadership role. Take charge of whatever it is that's going on. Become a person with a mission and that vision and that purpose. These are all outgrid related maneuvers. And then the upgrade maneuvers, she just demonstrated one. The upgrade maneuvers say, number one, increase the standards against which you're measuring this task. So she goes, I'm going to do it faster. Then the second one is that change the task in some subtle or profound way. She decided to gamify it. And so this is, the task is the task. She's getting her groceries. That's what's happening physically, but mentally, she's playing a game. And so this is an upgrade maneuver, and certainly awakening emotions. There's other things that we can be doing. I also want to bring to your attention this idea about where is noradrenaline present? Is it something that's more upgrid? Do we find it outgrid? Is it tied to perceived challenge? And to kind of demonstrate that point, I want to bring up this layer of the change grid, talking about the 16 energies. So particular, I want to look at the analytical driver, and you tell me whether or not a person in the analytical driver is experiencing any particular amount of noradrenaline in their system. The analytical driver, best described, is the scientist who is absolutely lost in the action of their research. So they are looking into a microscope, and they can be looking into that for literally for hours. And people would look at them from the outside and go, they're not doing anything. But inside of their head, they are very much paying exact attention, perhaps stronger, valuable, or a value added attention than the attention we would pay to something if we were upgraded in stress. And so focused attention, attention with a purpose, with a reason. And that, by the way, also gets us into the engagement rings layer of the change grid. That spot on the change grid, we find deep, deep engagement, but it's a downgrade engagement. It's not the enthusiastic, passionate, hooping and hollering engagement that we find in the upgrade area. It's this engagement of becoming totally engrossed in whatever it is you're going on. So when we're thinking about noradrenaline, is noradrenaline purely about attention, and whether that attention is something that could be causing you stress or something that is absolutely engaging you at the deepest possible level? Is there still noradrenaline happening?
Yes.
Okay, so that was a very long question for a one-word answer. Thank you very much.
Well, I was gonna say, yeah, yes, it is, because the concentration and the deep focus that you're talking about it's not going to constrict blood flow, right? You need some blood flow for that, because that's what attention is. So these attentional faculties, when they're operating, that's why it's kind of ridiculous for me to hear things like, we only utilize 10% of our brain. The brain is always on. We might not understand all parts of it, but we definitely don't only utilize 10% of our brain.
Yeah.
But thinking is it maximizes a lot of energy in terms of the brain's energy.
Yeah.
So that's why, texting and driving are two cognitive faculties that you're compromising one thing over the other. You're using the same attentional faculties that are competing for energy. Now, if you're doodling and you're doing something cognitive, you can get away with it, but not two of the same. Does that make sense?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. So definitely you'll be experiencing some noradrenaline there.
So we've been having a lot of hands go up. So I saw Ellen, you had your hand up. I think Joseph, you had your hand up. So whoever wants to chime in, just feel free.
Can I?
Yes, go ahead, Joseph, go ahead.
This is Joseph from the Netherlands. I just wanted to tap in the idea of brain activity and mental picturing, like Linda and some of the participants showed that you can actually influence the neurotransmitter activity or the adrenaline just by thinking.
Yeah.
And that's such an interesting point, because the brilliance of this change grid is actually in the word perceived.
It's
like
exactly right.
Perceived ability, perceived challenge. So maybe I'm interested in that because I've been coming across some books from Maxwell Maltz, and I'm wondering if you know it. It's called Psychocybernetics.
Yes.
And also the works of Napoleon Hill. They intensively work on mental picturing. So I was wondering how you use that in the change grid, and also how it reacts, maybe from Brian, on the adrenaline reaction.
Sure. Let me.
Think about the brain does not have a distinction when it sees a mental image, whether it's fake or real. So this is why they use visualizations for professional athletes that are coming back from a so-called career-ending injury. That's a significant part of their process. So you match an image with what Diane was talking about, with some kind of thought process, and you repeat that. The brain has no distinction for that. See, it's all this stuff that we get to add to it that doesn't necessarily need to be there, that becomes convoluted. And we're acting against ourselves. But the brain doesn't have a filter between a so-called real image or fake image. In fact, the eyes themselves has direct connectivity to the brainstem. That's how powerful imagery is. So by that, I mean, it doesn't have to go through a series of processing. The things that we see, whether in our mental eye or the things that we see physically, is processed immediately.
Now, let me add something to that idea about it being all about perceptions. Keep in mind that everyone we've ever trained in ChangeWorks or Pride-Based Leadership, Mastery Stream, any of the spin-off programs that are still based on tension management, these are lay people, or these are managers, or business leaders, or salespeople, or these are regular old people going about regular old life. They have no understanding probably, and no ability to do anything to actually directly manipulate anything that's going on inside of this human. The only thing that they can work with are people's perceptions. And so by asking the right questions, by creating an option in the way people might be thinking about something, by doing something to stimulate their cognitive process, we are able to impact the movement anywhere on the change grid we choose. And so now, again, when we take those skills and teach them to an individual, they can better do it for themselves. But all of our careers, all of our businesses are all about trying to help people better understand how they're currently framing whatever it is that's going on, and then using the appropriate set of change grid maneuvers or whatever other skills you want to add to the mix. But one way or another, what are we changing? We're changing people's thoughts. And by changing their thoughts, those thoughts then impact their attitudes, their beliefs, and ultimately their behavior. So so that's what it is. Now I love this conversation because we're kind of going, well, what runs what? Do the neurotransmitters run our thoughts and feelings? Or do our thoughts and feelings run the neurotransmitters, or is it a little bit of both? Now, again, we got lots of hands up. So Jane and Ellen, we'll give you guys the floor, and then Joseph, you're up again. So, yep.
Okay, well, a couple things, T, because you use the word framing, and a lot of what we're talking about and what Diane was talking about is what we would call reframing. So you take your current frame on reality and you reframe it in another way. And there's a wonderful author who published in the Neuroleadership Journal named Annette Pratt, who I think is from Holland. And she has a concept called frame storming, in which you are confronted by something that is challenging to you, and you see how many different frames you can put on it. And what happens each time you shift the frame. And so she's got some really interesting ways. There's sort of a methodology to look at that. And I can find that article, and I would be glad to send it along. The second thing that I notice is, I think you know, T, that I have worked a lot with visual images. And it's really interesting to see what happens with those. So I can have people look through all of the images, like a deck of 54 of them, and you can just ask them, you can just pose the question. Look for something that represents an aspiration of yours. And as they flip through it, all of a sudden they'll find something, and then you get the immediate emotional reaction as they start to talk about that. Conversely, I did something with a group of people. I frequently start an engagement with these pictures because I want an immediate mood shift and to put people in a particular state. But I did this with a group of people who were managers for an organization of refugees. And in this case, I didn't give them a choice. We just passed one out to everyone. So sometimes you give choice, sometimes you don't. But what happened for him is he got triggered by something from his past. And so that put him in, other than my intention, put him into something that he had to just kind of get away from the picture because of what it did. So I think that whole notion about the use of images and what happens with the brain is really powerful. And then also how you direct people in terms of the focus, and then they find something that begins to activate that particular state or give that particular information.
Excellent. That's really very interesting. And Ellen, so everyone knows, tell people what your background is.
I'm a clinical psychologist by training and have been working in business since about 1992.
Excellent. Okay, so all right, Jane, you have your hand up. What would you like to add to the
Oh, let's see. So I'm gonna see if I can weave all of these thoughts I've had ever since going back to being far upgrid. So I think one of the things that happens with, and Brian talked about this before, is when you have some kind of a triggering event, which we just talked about, it causes a flood of epinephrine if it's a fight or flight type of thing. And so correct me if I'm wrong, Brian, I've got to dig out my old memory here, but one of the purposes of epinephrine is to shunt blood flow from non-essential areas into the essential areas, like the heart, the lungs, the muscles, and everything, to act, to fight, or flee.
Exactly.
And so that decreases the blood flow to a certain extent to the frontal lobes, which is where the executive function of the brain happens. And so you're not as able to, in the initial flood of that, those transmitters, you may not necessarily be able to come up with the best solutions and be, you know, thinking about reframing and stuff like that. And that's where helping people build resilience is so important, because resilience is that ability to take a breath and say, wait a minute, is this true? And if you train around somatic, I've been doing some work around somatic coaching, and noticing the feeling in your body and noticing that triggering effect, which is that flood of neurotransmitters and everything, that increase in heart rate, tightness in your chest, tension in your body. If you can notice that as the first sign and begin then to question yourself, come back to center in your body, then you're able to say, okay, is this true? If not, how am I going to reframe this in a better way? So resilience is kind of a buzzword now, but I've been working as a coach, working with clients for years in training that resilience and that ability to recover from a trigger or a hot button.
Right. And resilience is all about PowerPoint maneuvers. How do we move ourselves more to the center of the change grid? Because from there, the world looks very different, and then we can choose what direction we would want to move in to impact whatever we're trying to impact. Okay, did I address everyone who had, well, for just 1 second, Brian, did I address everyone who had hands up? Okay, Brian, off to you then.
Hello?
I was just adding.
No, Joe, okay, sorry, Joseph.
Joseph.
Yeah.
Well, you're inspiring me, and there's a flooding a lot of ideas through my head. So maybe it's too much, but just let me fire. So you mentioned, Brian, that the neurotransmitter reactions, they are stimulated by vision, by the eyes or the mental picture. So I can understand, I expect that same happens with the smells or colors or music, what I also am exploring for attention management. So that's the question to Brian, and also to my dear teacher, Chi. How did you incorporate this type of stimulus into the attention management ideas?
Yeah, in fact, when we were first fleshing out the first merging of brilliance exercise, one of the things that we looked at was each of the 5 physical senses, and we asked, what impact does information being gathered from that sense have on someone's placement on the change grid? And the bottom line answer was that all senses lead to all locations. But that there are certain things, because of whatever learning we have, which becomes part of our programming, that cause things to happen very quickly. Like there are certain sounds we might hear that get our attention. So if you're walking late at night out and you hear a twig snap in the background, that's going to be one auditory piece of data that's going to get your attention really, really fast. And it didn't require you to stop for a moment and go like, well, now what could be causing that sound? No, we were programmed to go like, that could be a threat. Or if you smell smoke or something like that, you could do that. Now, I don't know about licking things so much. We decided that the gustatory sense was probably the one that was going to be least useful in surviving or whatever. I don't have to lick something to find out if it's a threat. But certainly smell, certainly auditory, certainly visual, and I think kinesthetic as well. So that whole thing, because we get certain sensations. So if I feel electricity, if I touch an outlet or whatever, and I get that little jolt, well, this is good information. So we did do that, but the bottom line was we decided that there were no specific trends that we could establish about the different sensory perceptions, with this one exception. And that is that when we did the merging with some of the principles from neuro-linguistic programming, one of the things that came out of it had to do with primary representational systems. So are you primarily a visual, an auditory, or a kinesthetic person? And so those of you who studied in NLP, there's a lot of interesting information around all that. And so then someone said in that, does your primary representational system ever change? Well, the moment the word change comes up, my head starts spinning. And so I went, I wonder what happens. And so I'm going to do this as a question for all of you. As someone's level of tension goes up, do you believe they are likely to become more dependent on a particular sensory receptor than elsewhere on the grid? So is something going to be more pronounced upgrid? Is something going to be more pronounced downgrid? And I'll give you what we came up with as the answer in air quotes, but I'm kind of curious. So do you guys think there's any patterns at all about the favoring of a representational system as the level of productive tension changes?
This is Kathy. I guess that there is, and I'm not quite sure what it is, but I know that the sense of smell has been considered to be probably the most primary sense that brings you back and stays in memory longer than any other sense. So my guess is that smell will be activated either upgrid or downgrid.
Okay.
I think that all those other sensory phenomenons that you're mentioning, I believe that the direct neuronal connection goes to the hypothalamus, which is memory. And so if you have a memory, for example, I worked with an intern whose house burned. Well, she had a memory for the smell of smoke and would react an extraordinary way, different than the rest of us. So I think that these other senses go to the hypothalamus, and it depends individually on what is stored there, what the experience and what the memory has been. For me, it's the smell of chocolate chip cookies baking.
There you go, there you go. Well, in fact, realtors will say if they're trying to sell a house, put cinnamon buns in the oven.
Yes.
So, because we have positive triggers to that. That's why at the airport, Cinnabon has their exhaust fans that they exhaust into the airport. So, yeah. Okay, couple of things. Wayne, who is our leading expert on neurolinguistic programming, says leading representational system is always contextual. I'll let you address that in just a second. I just want to add one thing to give you guys the answer. What we noticed was that as someone's level of tension goes up, they tended to become more visual. And so that's the sense. They're looking around, they're paying attention. A picture is worth 1,000 words. And so they tend to be being bombarded with images, blah, blah. That was what the pattern was. And similarly, as you moved very far down grid, you would become increasingly kinesthetic. And it would be more about whatever you're feeling, touching, those kinds of sensations. And in the middle, they said, you would think that makes you primarily auditory. And the answer was, no, that's where you're perfectly balanced. But that has nothing to do with what your primary representational system is. Some believe, or at least early on, was that your primary representational system was part of your personality because your key influencers, your key role models growing up may very well have exercised one of your senses to a much greater degree than others. And so if people kept exercising your visual sense, would it be surprising to find out that you happen to be very skilled when it comes to your visual sense or the auditory sense or whatever the case may be? So Wayne, if you'll unmute, I'd like you to just kind of complete your thought here about that it's the leading representational system. How is that different than the primary? And tell us about the contextuality of it.
Well, I push back against the idea of a primary singular rep system that people always rely on. It's like so many of the other meta programs. We have a tendency to lean on one or another, but like all meta programs, it depends on the context. So if we're trying to read a change grid and you come to that with an auditory rep system, we're trying to think about what's the internal dialogue or the external dialogue that goes with the points on the grid, that's great, but you have to still use the visual aspect if you're looking at the grid.
Right.
So different contexts, right? If you're on the phone with the person and you're trying to lead with visual, that's fine. You can use visual predicates. We can use words that imply, do you see what I'm saying? But we're still working in an auditory channel. So context will shift that. You may still try to lead, but you'll find out that even if your tendency was to go very visually, you're going to have to temper it based on the context, etc.
Exactly. We always said that you can't complete a crossword puzzle using only your kinesthetic sense. So you got to engage something else. Okay, well, we have just 1 minute left, and I need to end today's rather early, but so rather than going over. But I just want to tell you what we didn't get to today. Hopefully we can pick up on Thursday, and then I'll ask for your closing comments here. I wanted to just talk about what happens to dopamine, what happens to the other ones we've already talked about before we build on the rest of them. Also, Kathy sent over another document that I will share with all of you. This is a list of the neurotransmitters. It gives a little bit more information on them, and it includes histamine, which is one Brian really wanted to see introduced to that. So that's what we'll do on Thursday's call. Any closing comments? Any last things you want to throw into the mix?
Good.
Okay. All right then, well, thank you all very much for participating on today's call, and we will pick up where we left off next time. So thanks everybody. Bye for now.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.